Summer 1967. Greenwich Village, New York City. Anthony Tony Provenzano stood on the corner of West 10th Street, watching 40 young protesters march in circles outside the 6th Precinct police station. Black kids, white kids, holding signs that read, "Stop police brutality," and "CORE demands justice." Tony crushed his cigarette under his shoe and smiled. "Boss wants them gone," said the man beside him, a Genovese enforcer named Carmine Persico. "Then they'll be gone," Tony replied. What Tony didn't know, what nobody in the Italian mob knew, was that one man had already heard about their plan. His name was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, and the message Bumpy was about to send wouldn't just save those protesters' lives. It would make the 5 families understand something they'd forgotten. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson didn't just run the streets. He protected them. To understand what happened that July afternoon, you need to understand what CORE was fighting for. The Congress of Racial Equality wasn't some radical group trying to burn down buildings. They were college students, teachers, church members, people who believed that peaceful protest could change America. By 1967, CORE had been on the front lines of the civil rights movement for 25 years. They'd organized sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. They'd ridden Freedom Ride buses into the violent South. They'd marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. But in the summer of 1967, CORE's New York chapter had a new target, the New York Police Department. Because in neighborhoods like Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and the Lower East Side, police brutality wasn't just a problem. It was a daily nightmare. Black men getting beaten for looking suspicious. Latino teenagers getting arrested for standing on street corners. Mothers watching their sons get dragged into police vans for no reason except the color of their skin. On July 8, 1967, NYPD officers in Greenwich Village arrested a 19-year-old black student named Marcus Williams. Marcus had been walking home from City College when 2 cops stopped him, claiming he matched the description of a robbery suspect. He didn't, but that didn't matter. The cops threw Marcus against a patrol car, fractured his jaw with a nightstick, and arrested him for resisting arrest. 3 days later, Marcus was still in custody. The charges? Assaulting an officer. The evidence? The blood on the cop's nightstick. Marcus's blood. CORE's Greenwich Village chapter, led by a 24-year-old organizer named Raymond Mitchell, decided to act. On July 12th, they set up a picket line outside the 6th Precinct station. 40 protesters. Peaceful. Orderly. Chanting justice for Marcus and end police brutality. The police? They ignored them. But someone else was watching. Greenwich Village in 1967 wasn't just bohemian coffee shops and jazz clubs. It was prime real estate for the Italian mob. The Genovese crime family controlled most of the neighborhood's rackets, gambling operations, loan sharking, protection money from local businesses. And the 6th Precinct? They had an arrangement. Captain Robert Brennan, the precinct commander, was on the Genovese payroll. $2,000 a month to look the other way when mob business went down. $500 extra whenever they needed a favor. But these CORE protesters? They were bad for business. 40 kids with signs standing outside the police station every day drew attention. News cameras, reporters, city officials asking questions. And attention was the last thing the mob wanted. On July 14th, 2 days after the protest started, Captain Brennan made a phone call. The man who answered was Vincent Chin Gigante, underboss of the Genovese family. "We got a problem, Chin," Brennan said. "These CORE kids are camping outside my station. It's bringing heat. I need them gone." Chin was quiet for a moment. Then he said 5 words that would set everything in motion. "I'll handle it personally." Chin Gigante wasn't known for gentle solutions. In 1957, he tried to assassinate mob boss Frank Costello by shooting him in the head. Costello survived, but barely. By 1967, Chin was one of the most feared men in New York. And when Chin said he'd handle something, people usually ended up in the hospital or the morgue. Chin called a meeting at a social club on Sullivan Street. Present were Anthony Provenzano, Genovese enforcer, Carmine Persico, future Colombo family boss, and a captain named Thomas Tommy Ryan Aboli. "These CORE kids," Chin said, lighting a cigar. "They're making noise at the 6th Precinct. Brennan wants them gone." quietly. How quiet? Asked Provenzano. Chin smiled. Quiet enough that they don't come back. Loud enough that everybody else gets the message. The plan was simple. Wait until the protesters were alone. No cameras. No witnesses. Then send in 20 guys with baseball bats and chains. Break a few bones. Crack a few skulls. Make it clear that protesting in Greenwich Village was a bad idea. When? Asked Tommy Ryan. Tomorrow night, Chin said. After dark, when the cops go home. What Shinjigani didn't know was that his plan had already been leaked. Not by a rat, not by an informant, but by a bartender named Eddie Coleman who worked at the Sullivan Street Club. Eddie was black, born in Harlem, raised on 125th Street. And Eddie knew that when the mob was planning violence against civil rights protesters, there was only one man who could stop it. Bumpy Johnson. July 14th, 1967, 10:30 p.m. Eddie Coleman knocked on the door of Small's Paradise, a jazz club on 135th Street and 7th Avenue. The club was closed, but Eddie knew Bumpy was upstairs. Bumpy Johnson kept an office above Small's, a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking Harlem. It was where he conducted business, where he made decisions, where he kept Harlem safe. The door opened. Illinois Gordon, one of Bumpy's most trusted men, stood in the doorway. Eddie, Gordon said. It's late. I need to see Bumpy, Eddie replied. It's urgent. 2 minutes later, Eddie was sitting across from Bumpy Johnson himself. Bumpy was 62 years old in 1967, but he looked 10 years younger. Sharp gray suit, fedora on the desk beside him, eyes that missed nothing. Talk, Bumpy said. Eddie told him everything. The core protest at the 6th Precinct, Captain Brennan's call to Shinjigani, the meeting at the Sullivan Street Club, the plan to attack the protesters tomorrow night. When Eddie finished, Bumpy was silent for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer, pulled out $500, and handed it to Eddie. You didn't see anything, Bumpy said. You weren't there. Understand? Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson. After Eddie left, Illinois Gordon spoke. Bumpy, this ain't our fight. These are college kids protesting downtown. We got enough problems up here. Bumpy stood up and walked to the window, looking out over Harlem. You remember 1964? Bumpy asked. Gordon nodded. The Harlem riot. NYPD shot a 15-year-old kid named James Powell. Killed him for no reason. And when our people protested, the cops came in with nightsticks and dogs. Beat our people in the streets like animals. Bumpy turned back to Gordon. Those core kids downtown, they're fighting the same fight we're fighting up here. The same cops who crack skulls in Harlem are the same cops who crack skulls in the village. And if Shinjigani thinks he can beat down civil rights protesters without answering to me, he's got another thing coming. So what are you going to do? Gordon asked. Bumpy smiled. I'm going to remind the 5 families who really runs this city. July 15th, 1967, 2 p.m. Bumpy Johnson didn't waste time. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to Raymond Mitchell, the core organizer leading the Greenwich Village protest. Raymond had never met Bumpy Johnson, but he'd heard the name. Everyone in New York had heard the name. Mr. Mitchell, Bumpy said when Raymond answered. My name is Bumpy Johnson. I need you to listen very carefully. Tonight, after dark, men are coming to hurt you and your protesters. I need you to clear the picket line by 6 p.m. and stay away until I tell you it's safe. Raymond was confused. Who's coming? The police. Worse, Bumpy replied. The mob. But don't worry. I'm handling it. Why would you help us? Raymond asked. Because what you're fighting for matters, Bumpy said. And because in this city, nobody touches civil rights protesters without answering to me. The second call was to William Gardner Smith, a black American journalist who'd been living in Paris for years. Smith had returned to the United States in 1967 to write a book called Return to Black America, interviewing major figures about the state of race relations. He'd already spoken with Stokely Carmichael, H. Rat Brown, and Elijah Muhammad. Now he wanted to interview Bumpy Johnson. Mr. Smith, Bumpy said, I know you're writing a book. I want you to witness something tomorrow. Something that needs to be recorded. What's happening? Smith asked. You'll see, Bumpy replied. Be at Small's Paradise tomorrow at noon. The third call was to Shinjigani. This was the most important call, the one that would determine everything. When Chin answered, Bumpy didn't waste words. Chin, it's Bumpy. We need to talk. Tonight. Neutral ground. Chin was silent for a moment. Then where? The Red Rooster. 138th Street. 8 p.m. Come alone. And if I don't? Bumpy's voice dropped to ice. Then what happens tomorrow in Greenwich Village won't be a beating. It'll be a war. And you know how wars in Harlem end, Chin. They end with Italian bodies in the East River. Chin hung up without answering. But at 8 p.m. that night, he showed up. The Red Rooster was a soul food restaurant on 138th Street. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread. The best food in Harlem. It was also neutral territory, a place where business got done without bloodshed. Bumpy sat at a corner table, back to the wall, watching the door. At 8:03 p.m., Chin Gigani walked in, alone as requested. But Bumpy knew there were probably 3 Genovese soldiers waiting in a car outside, just in case. Chin sat down across from Bumpy. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Bumpy pushed a plate of fried chicken across the table. Eat, Bumpy said. We're going to be here a while. Chin ignored the food. What's this about, Bumpy? Greenwich Village, Bumpy replied. The core protesters at the 6th precinct. I know you're planning to hit them tomorrow night. Chin's face didn't change, but Bumpy saw his jaw tighten. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult me, Chin. Eddie Coleman heard the whole thing at your Sullivan Street Club. Tony Pro, Carmine, Tommy Ryan. 20 guys with bats and chains. Tomorrow night, after dark. Chin leaned back in his chair. Those kids are bad for business. They're bringing heat to the precinct. Brennan asked me to handle it. And you think beating up college students is handling it? Bumpy asked. It's worked before, Chin said. Bumpy's eyes went cold. Not this time. Why do you care? Chin asked. These aren't your people. They're not from Harlem. They're white kids and black kids from NYU playing revolutionary downtown. This ain't your fight, Bumpy. Bumpy leaned forward. You're right. They're not from Harlem. But they're fighting the same fight we're fighting up here. Police brutality. Racism. The same cops who beat those kids in the village are the same cops who beat our people in Harlem. And if you think I'm going to sit back and watch the mob do the NYPD's dirty work, you're out of your mind. So what are you proposing? Chin asked. Bumpy's voice was quiet but firm. You call off the hit. You tell Brennan to handle his own problems. And you make sure every family in New York knows that civil rights protesters are off limits. Chin laughed. Actually laughed. You think I'm going to take orders from you? This is Greenwich Village, Bumpy. Not Harlem. You got no jurisdiction downtown. Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Chin, let me explain something to you. I don't need jurisdiction. I need leverage. And I got plenty of it. Like what? Like the fact that your nephew, Michael Gigani, runs a heroin operation out of a warehouse on Pleasant Avenue. The same warehouse where he keeps $400,000 in cash and 50 kilos of uncut product. Chin's expression didn't change, but Bumpy saw his hands tighten on the table. If anything happens to those core protesters, Bumpy continued, that warehouse burns to the ground. Michael's cash burns. His product burns. And I make sure the NYPD knows exactly who to arrest. You're threatening me, Chin said quietly. I'm protecting those kids, Bumpy replied. How you take is up to you. For a long moment, Chin Gigani stared at Bumpy Johnson. Then he spoke the words that would become legend. If any of those core kids are harmed, I will not guarantee the safety of any mafia member in Harlem. That was it. 17 words. Delivered in a calm, steady voice that somehow carried more weight than 1,000 threats. Chin understood exactly what Bumpy was saying. If the mob attacked those protesters, every Italian operation in Harlem would be a target. Numbers runners would disappear. Loan sharks would get beaten. Gambling operations would get raided. And the 5 families would lose millions. All to teach some college kids a lesson. Chin stood up. I'll call it off, he said. But this doesn't mean we're friends, Bumpy. We were never friends, Chin, Bumpy replied. But we're businessmen. And businessmen understand leverage. Chin walked out without another word. Bumpy sat there for another 30 minutes, finishing his fried chicken, knowing that he'd just prevented a massacre. July 16th, 1967, 9 a.m. Tony Provenzano was in the middle of breakfast when his phone rang. It It was Chin Gigani. The Greenwich Village thing is off, Chin said. Stand down. What? What? Because I said so, Chin replied, and hung up. Tony stared at the phone, confused. But orders were orders. That afternoon, Captain Brennan called Chin, furious. What happened? You said you'd handle those protesters. I did handle them, Chin replied. I handled them by leaving them alone. Figure it out yourself, Brennan. And that was the end of it. The core protesters continued their picket line for another 2 weeks. No violence. No attacks. No mob interference. On July 28th, the NYPD finally agreed to investigate Marcus Williams's case. The charges were dropped. The officers who beat him were suspended, though never charged. And CORE declared victory. Raymond Mitchell never forgot what Bumpy Johnson did. Years later, in a 1985 interview, Raymond said, "We didn't know Bumpy Johnson personally, but somehow he heard about the threat against us. And he stopped it. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't ask for anything. He just did it because it was the right thing to do." July 16th, 1967. Noon. William Gardner Smith showed up at Small's Paradise as Bumpy had requested. Bumpy told him everything. The mob's plan to attack the protesters. The meeting with Chin Gigani. The 17-word threat that stopped it all. Smith was stunned. "Why are you telling me this?" Smith asked. "Because I want it written down," Bumpy replied. "I want people to know that when the civil rights movement needed protection in this city, it wasn't the police who stepped up. It wasn't the politicians. It was Bumpy Johnson." Smith included the story in his 1970 book, Return to Black America. He wrote, "According to rumor, or legend as things have become in relation to Johnson, he sent a simple message. If any of those core kids are harmed, I will not guarantee the safety of any mafia member in Harlem." The book wasn't a bestseller, but it preserved the story. It made sure that one of Bumpy Johnson's most important acts, protecting civil rights protesters from mob violence, wouldn't be forgotten. Word of what Bumpy did spread through New York's underworld like wildfire. By the next week, every mobster from Boston to Baltimore knew the story. Bumpy Johnson had threatened Chin Gigani and the Genovese family to protect civil rights protesters. And Chin had backed down. For some, it was confirmation of what they'd always believed. Bumpy Johnson was untouchable. For others, it was a lesson. You don't mess with Harlem. You don't mess with Bumpy's people. And you definitely don't mess with civil rights protesters if Bumpy Johnson is watching. The five families called an unofficial meeting in August 1967. The topic? Bumpy Johnson and the Negro problem. Carlo Gambino, boss of the Gambino family, summed it up. "We leave Harlem alone. We leave Bumpy alone. And we make it clear to every captain, every soldier, every associate. Civil rights protesters are off limits. We're not doing the cops' dirty work anymore." It was the first time the Italian mob had ever issued a hands-off order regarding civil rights activists. Not because they supported the movement, but because Bumpy Johnson had made the cost of interference too high. Bumpy Johnson lived another year after the Greenwich Village incident. On July 7th, 1968, he died of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He was eating fried chicken and hominy grits when his heart gave out. He was 62 years old. When news of his death spread, Harlem mourned. Thousands of people lined the streets for his funeral. Politicians, jazz musicians, businessmen, hustlers. Everyone came to pay their respects. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was Harlem's protector. The man who stood between his community and the wolves that wanted to devour it. And what happened in Greenwich Village in 1967 was proof of that. Bumpy didn't have to protect those core protesters. They weren't from his neighborhood. They weren't paying him. They were just kids fighting for justice. But Bumpy understood something that most gangsters never learned. Power isn't just about controlling territory. It's about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. It's about using your influence for something bigger than money or fear. It's about standing up when nobody else will. That's why the five families backed down. Not because Bumpy was more violent. Not because he had more money. But because Bumpy Johnson had something they could never buy. The respect of his community. The loyalty of his people. And the willingness to risk everything to do what was right. Here's what most people miss about Bumpy Johnson. They think he was just a numbers runner. A gangster who got lucky and stayed alive longer than most. But Bumpy was a strategist, a chess player, a man who understood that real power comes from knowing what your enemy values and what they fear. Shinjigani valued money and territory. He feared losing both. So Bumpy threatened his nephew's heroin operation. $400,000 in cash. 50 kilos of product, all gone if the core protesters got hurt. That wasn't violence. That wasn't gangster tactics. That was leverage. That was Bumpy seeing 10 moves ahead and making Chin choose between his pride and his profit. And Chin chose profit. Every time. But here's the deeper truth. Bumpy didn't just save those protesters that night. He sent a message to every civil rights organizer in New York. The message was simple. You're not alone. Even when the police won't protect you. Even when the politicians ignore you. Even when the mob wants you gone. There's someone watching. Someone who understands that what you're fighting for matters. And that someone will make sure you can keep fighting. Raymond Mitchell, the core organizer, said it best in 1985. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. I'm not going to romanticize that. But he was also the only person in New York who stood between us and a beating that would have put half our chapter in the hospital. And I'll never forget that. Look, if this story got you hyped, do me a favor. Hit that like button real quick. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We're dropping these Bumpy Johnson stories every day. And trust me, the next one is even crazier. Drop a comment and let me know. Could Bumpy have handled this differently? Would you have taken the same risk to protect strangers? Remember, in Harlem, respect wasn't given. It was earned. And Bumpy Johnson earned his every single day.